The Nimzo-Indian defense is one of the strongest defenses that exist and is a favorite of grandmasters due to its great strategic and tactical content. The positions that arise from this defense are very unbalanced positions that allow you to play to win with either side. After d4, black can answer knight f6, developing his king's knight and taking control of the e4 square. In this way, white is prevented from occupying the center with his pawns. White can play c4, to increase his control over the central squares. Black answers with e6, increasing his control over the d5 square and allowing the development of the king's bishop. After knight c3, white develops his queen's knight and threatens to occupy the center with his pawns by playing e4. Black can play bishop b4, entering the Nimzo-Indian defense. Black does not occupy the center with pawns but prefers to let the opponent occupy the center with his pawns and then attack him with pieces from far away according to the principles of the hypermodern school. Black's main idea is to control the e4 square. With the move bishop b4 they pin white's knight and temporarily prevent white from occupying the center with his pawns. From this position white can use 4 basic development systems. A 3 is the Saemisch system. White quickly interrogates the bishop and forces the exchange. After bishop takes c3. B takes c3 white reinforces the center and has obtained the pair of bishops. However, with move a3 they have lost valuable time. Now there are many possible moves for black but one of the best and that best fits black's playing principles is the move b6. Black's idea is to develop his queen's bishop on the b7 square to control the long diagonal and dominate the e4 square. Of course, other possible moves are d5 or c5 that directly challenge the white center but have the disadvantage that having pawn contact in the center will possibly produce changes and this would open the game that would give white's bishop pair an advantage. With the move b6, black wants to keep the game as close as possible so that his knights have a certain advantage over white's bishops. Black is also not interested in castling too early because then white could attack on the king's side and the king would be in a very bad position. So, the move b6 is very flexible one. Now the best move for white is f3 which is directly threatening to play e4 and establish a strong pawn center. The strong points of white's position are the strong pawn center and the bishop pair. If white makes the move e3 then bishop b7 could continue attacking the g2 pawn and also forcing the move f3. Because if white plays knight f3 then black directly occupies the e4 point with the knight and establishes a strong blockage in that square. For example, white could follow bishop d3. Black plays f5, reinforcing the e4 point and after queen c2. Black castles. White castles. From this position black can play as in the Dutch defense with moves like rook f6 and rook h6 or rook g6. d6 to develop the knight through d7 and attack on the king's side taking advantage of the large diagonal of light squares. For his part, white needs to remove the knight to be able to make the move f3 and expel the d4 knight. Then they can advance with e4 and d5 to neutralize the bishop on the long diagonal and perhaps a4 and a5 to weaken the queenside and perhaps give way to their other bishop through the a3 square. After the move b6, white can play f3, with the idea of continuing with e4 and forming a powerful pawn center. Black has to react quickly if he doesn't want to be crushed. Now, they can play bishop a6, attacking white's c4 point. After, for example, e4. Black can continue with knight c6. And from this position black's plan is clear, attack the c4 pawn. The knight will go to the a5 square and between the bishop and the knight they will put strong pressure on the c4 square, which is a weak point in white's position. They can also make moves like d6 that would prevent the advance. e5 and the queen can go to d7 and then from c6 press again on the pawn on c4. Sometimes she could go to c8, b7 and c6, or the pawn could advance to c5 and bring the rook to c8, and after the exchange c takes d for the rook would have the c file open. If white attacks with bishop g5, then h6 will drive out the bishop, and here we see the advantage of not having castled yet, because black could challenge the bishop with h6 and eventually g5 and would have his king well placed. In case white plays e5, then the knight could retreat to g8 and then reactivate by e7, and when the knight retreat to g8, white will not have the move queen g4 at his disposal, since his pawn is on f3. For its part, white's plans consist of developing the pieces with bishop d3, knight e2, or knight h3. The bishop can go to g5, and if it is expelled it will be recycled by h4 and f2. The queen may defend the c4 point from e2 or also from a4. Even the rook could collaborate in the defense with the maneuver rook b1 and rook b4. The disadvantage of placing the queen on e2 to defend the pawn on c4 is that when the black knight is on a5 it can at some point jump to the b3 square and capture one of white's two bishops. Another of the most used and main variations is the so-called Rubinstein variation that begins with the move e3. Black can also continue with the move b6, which is a very flexible move. As we have already said, knight f3 would allow knight e4 to take advantage of the pin and then continue with f5 with ideas similar to what we have seen before. Rubinstein's original idea was to play knight e2 to defend the knight and then expel the bishop with a3 and avoid the doubling of pawns. But at this moment the knight prevents the bishop from defending the pawn on c4. Black can react with bishop a6 that quickly attacks the c4 point. The move knight e4 is also interesting. After bishop a6, white can play a3. Bishop takes c3 check. Knight takes c3. d5 with the idea of changing the light square bishops. Now white has to defend the pawn with the move b3, and black can continue with his usual knight c6 plan to get the knight to the a5 square. c5, rook c8, and the king could castle on the king's side. After the move b6, one of the most natural moves is bishop d3, who controls the e4 square and then wants to develop the king's knight on the e2 square. Black can continue bishop b7, attacking the g2 point and forcing the blockade of the f3 square. White can play knight f3, blockading the long diagonal to defend the pawn on g2. After the move knight f3, black could continue knight e4. White can castle. Now black cannot capture on c3 because the piece would be trapped, but black has a good continuation with the move f5 and continue with the usual plans based on rook f6, rook h6, d6 to develop the queen's knight through the d7 square. Or maybe the bishop can come to d6, taking advantage of the fact that the pawn is not there yet, and take advantage of the two diagonals and play in the style of the Dutch defense. Another idea for white is the so-called classic variation that begins with the move queen c2, a move that prevents the doubling of pawns and at the same time controls the e4 square. But has the disadvantage that the queen has moved to c2 and now the pawn on d4 is unprotected. Therefore, the best move for black would be c5, immediately attacking the d4 point, and now white's center is going to disappear. For example, now white could not play a3 because, after bishop takes c3 check, queen takes c3, c takes d4. Queen takes d4 and black gains a very important time with knight c6, attacking the opposing queen. Black has a very good game. Against any other move, black is going to capture on d4 and white's center will disappear. The only move white has to try to fight for advantage is d takes c5. But this move already represents a small victory for black, since white loses his central pawn. Black plays bishop takes c5. White can develop his queen bishop to g5 or to f4 with the idea of pressurizing on the d6 square. With the move rook to d1 they will also put pressure on that square. The king's knight can be developed to f3 and the bishop will go to d3. White will be able to castle short and try to get a good game. For its part, Black can play queen to b6 trying to force White to play e3 and thus lock in his c1 bishop. Afterwards, the queen can return to c7 and with moves like d6, b6 and a6, having previously removed the bishop to the e7 square, they would achieve a hedgehog-type position. Then with moves like h6, short castling and knight d7 and knight c5, Black obtains a very good position. The last variation that we are going to consider in this video is the so-called Leningrad variation that begins with the move bishop to g5. White performs a counterpin in reaction to Black's pin. Black can play h6, directly challenging the bishop. Now it makes no sense to change the bishop for the knight, because then White gives away one of his greatest trumps for free, which is the pair of bishops. Therefore, the bishop retreats to h4 but now Black can play c5 and begins to react quickly in the center. Now White's only move to try to gain an advantage is the advance d5 since if, for example, he makes the move e3 then c takes d4 would follow. And after e takes d4. Queen a5, Black presses against the c3 point. After queen c2 and knight e4, Black has a lot of initiative. So, after c5 the only way to fight for advantage is with the move d5 but now Black can play bishop takes c3. B takes c3. d6. Now it would be a mistake to take on e6 because after bishop takes e6 the doubled pawns on the c-file are very weak and Black can continue with moves like g5 to expel the bishop and then knight e4 to change dark square's bishop. And after queen e7, knight c6 and long castling, Black has a very good position. So, after d6 the best move for White is e3. Black can close the center with e5, placing his pawns on dark squares so that his light square bishop can be active. Since the center is blocked, Black's knights will have many possibilities. They will be able to make moves like g5 to continue knight h5 and even f5 and f4 to enclose the bishop on g3 or also bishop f5 to control the e4 point. The queen's knight could go via d7, f8 and g6 to a good square. And before the advance of White's a-pawn, Black could react with b6 and a5. The Black king can castle long and Black has a very good position. White, for his part, can make moves like bishop d3, knight e2 to follow f3 and e4. They could also even attack on the king side with g4, h4 and h5. If the bishop on h4 is attacked it can retreat to the f2 and e3 squares, which in combination with the queen on d2 could put pressure on the f4 square. Likewise with a4. a5 and a6 White will try to weaken the opponent's queenside. Normally White does not castle but keeps his king in the center since with the center blocked he will be safer than on the king's side where Black will presumably be able to attack. In the next videos we will study very illustrative games in which you will be able to see how all these ideas can be applied in practice.